An excavator lifted a chest from the bottom of the river. Inside, there was no gold or jewels, but rather the secret of a wealthy family that had been hidden for almost a century. What the archaeologists found shocked everyone. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The river lay heavy with silence, broken only by the churning sounds of machines that had been brought to dredge its shallow, sluggish waters. It was not the kind of river that invited swimmers or poets. It had grown thick with weeds, with silt that clung like glue, with old branches that had drifted in decades before and never found a way back out. Along the banks, reeds stood like sentries, tall and green, bending and whispering with each touch of the wind. The men who worked there had grown used to the rhythm of metal against mud, the scoop of the excavator arm dragging up rocks and clumps of earth, the splash of discarded debris being dropped aside. Their labor was part of a greater effort to reinforce the banks, to prevent the river from spreading into the nearby fields during spring rains, and to keep the water from undermining the cracked foundations of the old bridge. What began as routine changed in a single moment. The great arm of the excavator descended again into the murky current, its bucket vanishing beneath the surface with a sucking sound. It had been like every other descent until the machine gave a shudder, the kind that traveled up its steel bones and made the operator tense. He pulled the controls back, the bucket rising slowly, and from the brown water came a shape that immediately drew every pair of eyes. At first it seemed to be just another object dragged from the bed, perhaps an old appliance or some discarded machinery, until its form grew clear. A great rectangular chest, bound with iron straps, dripping with centuries of mud, emerged like a ghost from the earth itself. Gasps echoed along the shore. The chest was massive, its edges reinforced with blackened steel, its surfaces scarred by rust but not broken. The bucket held it awkwardly, the weight causing the excavator to groan, and yet it clung together. Water poured off in streams, cascading down the sides, splattering the ground. One of the men shouted for the machine to steady, and a crowd began to gather from the nearby houses, their daily chores abandoned for the spectacle of something extraordinary. They edged closer to the riverbank, eyes wide, murmurs passing from one to the next like a current of their own. The chest was lowered carefully onto the grass, where it landed with a heavy, sodden thud. Silence hung, broken only by the hiss of the engine and the drip of water from the iron fittings. For a long moment, no one dared approach. The air itself seemed charged, as though some long-held secret had been disturbed. It was not the kind of thing one expected to see rising from a river. Not a barrel, not a log, but something deliberate, crafted, and clearly of age. The lock, though corroded, remained intact, shaped in a style that had long since disappeared from common use. Among the onlookers were older townsfolk, their backs bent, their faces lined by time. They leaned on canes and whispered to each other, and from their lips came a story that younger ears had only half believed. There had been talk, passed down through families, of a great flood that had swept through nearly a century earlier. In that flood, it was said, not only houses and livestock were carried away, but also a chest, a heavy one, belonging to one of the most powerful families the town had ever known. Children had grown up with the tale, though over time it had turned into myth, embroidered with imagination and disbelief. Some said it was full of gold. Others swore it held family records or cursed relics, but always the story ended with the same phrase: the river had swallowed it whole, and it was never seen again. Now, with the mud-covered chest lying before them, the whispers grew sharper, louder, tinged with awe and unease. Could this be the very object their grandparents had spoken of by firelight? The chest was larger than most imagined, its corners bolted with rivets, the wood swollen and warped from decades in water. Even in its ruin, it carried a dignity, a sense of something precious once guarded inside. The sight of it conjured the past, not in fragments or photographs, but as though the past itself had clawed its way into the present. The men debated what to do, to pry it open there on the riverbank, in full view of every curious child and gossiping neighbor, risked ruining whatever secrets it might still keep. The chest's metal bands groaned each time someone touched it, and the mud that clung to it like a second skin seemed almost protective, as though warning against haste. A decision was reached quietly, but firmly. The chest would not be opened here. It would be taken into safekeeping, where specialists could examine it without the rush of hands eager to pry it apart. The excavator lowered its bucket again, and with ropes and a harness hastily arranged, the chest was lifted onto a waiting truck. Cameras clicked, cell phones flashed, and more people arrived, leaving their errands undone, their kitchens empty of cooks, their shops temporarily unattended. The chest became the town's heart for that moment, drawing everyone into its orbit. Even as it was driven away, people followed on foot, as if compelled to keep watch. Inside the storage hangar on the edge of town, the chest was set down once more, this time on clean boards under electric light. The atmosphere was different here, not the wild, uncertain energy of discovery, but a hushed reverence. Experts were summoned, historians from the regional university, archivists who specialized in family estates, and archaeologists with the patience to work mud into memory. They circled the chest, noted the craftsmanship, speculated about its age. Every rivet, every hinge was studied, each detail offering a clue to the time and hands that had forged it. That night, even before any scholar had laid a formal word upon it, the town was already alive with conjecture. At the pub, men leaned close over their mugs, their voices lowered, but urgent. In kitchens, women remembered what their grandmothers had said about the flood, piecing together half-forgotten lines of memory. Children lay awake, their imaginations stirring with visions of treasure. And the elders, the ones who had always spoken of the chest, now found themselves vindicated at last, their stories no longer dismissed as fancy. The chest had risen, and with it had risen the voices of the past. It had been hidden by water for nearly 100 years, and now it sat waiting, silent, its secrets still locked away. Yet the simple fact of its existence had already begun to shift the town's sense of itself. The ordinary had cracked open, and behind it stood the shadow of history. And so, in that quiet hangar, under the hum of electric lights, the chest remained, looming like a sentinel, its secrets intact, but trembling on the edge of revelation. It was no longer only an artifact. It was a bridge between what had been lost and what was waiting to be remembered. The river had given up its captive, and now the burden fell to the living to decide what to do with it. The chest rested under the glare of the warehouse lamps, its presence so commanding that even the silence around it seemed heavier than usual. Though the lock had not yet been broken, the discovery alone was enough to stir imaginations, and as the hours turned into days, the town could not stop speaking of it. Children pressed their faces to the glass of the warehouse windows, trying to catch a glimpse of the iron-bound silhouette. Adults exchanged whispers in the market, recalling stories their parents and grandparents had murmured long ago. The town was alive in a way it had not been for years, as if the chest itself had awakened something buried not only in the river, but also in memory. But the present could not hold it alone. To understand why the chest mattered, the scholars who gathered around it began piecing together the world from which it had come. They opened archives, brought fragile newspapers from long sealed drawers, unrolled brittle maps that still bore the ink of a vanished hand. And slowly, a picture began to emerge of a time nearly a century before, when the river had not been the sluggish, weed-choked thing it was now, but a restless force, a channel for storms that had no mercy for the people living near its banks. In the early 1920s, the town had been different. Streets were narrow and muddy, lined with wooden houses, painted in pale colors that the rain quickly stripped. Horses still clattered over cobblestones, carriages splashed through puddles, and only a handful of automobiles rattled uncertainly across the bridge that spanned the river. Yet for all its modest size, the town was proud, its center crowned by the grandest building for miles around, the mansion of the Ashford family, a dynasty whose name was woven into the economy, the schools, the very stones of the bridge itself. They were more than residents. They were a presence, one that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. When the flood came, the town had been unprepared. Days of relentless rain had swollen the river until it rose like a living thing, first nibbling at the fields, then surging past the banks, then sweeping through the streets with a roar that seemed to drown the world. People clutched what they could carry, fleeing to higher ground, while the rest, their livestock, their furniture, their memories, was torn away. Houses collapsed under the force, shops were gutted, the bridge trembled as if it would be carried off too. And amid this chaos, the Ashford mansion, though built on slightly higher land, wasn't spared. The waters surged into its cellars, ripped through its gardens, and by nightfall, it stood like a wounded giant, scarred, its grandeur mocked by the brown torrent that swirled at its gates. There were stories told even then of what the Ashfords had tried to save. Servants were seen struggling with bundles, trunks, crates, dragging them toward carriages that could not get far. It was said that one particular chest, heavier than the rest, was loaded onto a cart pulled by 2 terrified horses. Whether the cart tipped, whether the floodwaters stole it outright, or whether it was abandoned in the panic, no one could say for certain. What they could say was that the chest was never seen again. From that moment onward, it lived only in memory, its fate swallowed by the river. The Ashfords were not just any family. Their fortune had been built over decades, through mills and shipping lines, through the shrewdness of deals struck behind closed doors. They held power that extended beyond the town, and their presence was so commanding that few dared speak of them except in respectful tones. But power, as it often does, came with shadows. For in the years just before the flood, tragedy had touched the family in a way they sought desperately to conceal. They had a son, Edward, who had been frail since birth. Though the family never admitted it publicly, those who lived near the mansion noticed how seldom the boy appeared outside its gates, and when he did, how pale he looked, how he coughed into handkerchiefs pressed quickly into his hand by the nursemaid. His childhood was quiet, lived mostly in rooms shaded by heavy curtains, filled with toys brought from abroad, but lacking the company of other children. Then one day he was gone. There was no funeral for the boy, no public acknowledgement of his passing. Servants whispered that he had died after a long illness, that the family had locked themselves in mourning. Yet in the newspapers, there was no mention of him at all. It was as if he had never existed. His name disappeared. His face vanished from the world outside those walls. And though the family continued on, hosting dinners, managing their empire, and maintaining their careful facade, those who knew them well sensed the silence that hung over the mansion. The chest, then, became a vessel not just for belongings, but for memory. Rumors swirled after the flood that the Ashfords had tried to preserve the child's possessions in one great trunk, storing away the toys, the letters, the photographs they could not bear to look at, but also could not destroy. To some, it was an act of love, a desperate attempt to hold on. To others, it was further proof of their obsession with appearances, an effort to hide the truth rather than face it. Whatever the intention, the chest was lost, and with it, the last tangible evidence of the boy's short life. As the scholars uncovered more details, they saw how carefully the family had managed their image. Old editions of the town's newspaper, carefully preserved in bound volumes, told of charity galas, business expansions, and social triumphs. Nowhere was there mention of the boy's illness. Nowhere was there an obituary. The family portraits that hung in the archives showed only the parents, solemn and dignified, their gazes fixed toward posterity, as though erasing their son from the frame erased him from their lineage. Yet the people remembered. Among the elders, those who had been children themselves when the flood struck, memories stirred like embers fanned into flame. They recalled hushed conversations overheard at night, their mothers whispering about the pale boy who played in the gardens, the way the nurse pushed him gently on a swing, the faint sound of his laughter carried on the wind. They remembered the sudden silence when he was gone, the way neighbors avoided asking questions. And they remembered most of all the night of the flood, when someone had shouted that the Ashfords were carrying a chest, and that the river had claimed it. Now, standing in the present, these elders came to the warehouse and peered at the iron-bound form under the lamps, their eyes misting not with greed or curiosity, but with recognition. For them, it was not just an object. It was the return of a story half forgotten, the vindication of memories that had been pushed aside by the passage of time. They leaned on their canes and told the younger ones that the chest was no treasure chest in the sense of gold or jewels, but something more fragile, the treasure of a child's life, once hidden, now found. The scholars recorded these accounts, adding them to their files. Slowly, the narrative grew richer, heavier with meaning. This was not merely an artifact dredged from the mud, but a piece of living history, tied to grief, silence, and the ways families protect their reputations. The Ashfords had buried their sorrow under layers of wealth and denial, but the river had preserved what they had tried to erase. In the town, the sense of anticipation grew sharper. People no longer asked if the chest would be opened, but when. Every day it sat sealed, its secret unspoken. The tension deepened. Some hoped for valuables, others for documents that would expose the truth about the Ashfords. But for the elders, and for the scholars, it was enough to know that the chest existed, that the river had returned it. They believed it held the story of a child who had been silenced, and they waited for the moment when the lock would give way and the past would finally speak. The warehouse lights dimmed each night, leaving the chest alone in the dark. Yet it seemed, even in stillness, to breathe. The mud dried and flaked away. The rust caught the glow of passing headlights, and the silence around it was thick with expectation. The town slept, but its dreams were filled with images of the flood, the mansion, and the pale boy whose memory had floated unseen beneath the surface for nearly a century. Now, with the chest resting within reach, that memory stirred again, ready to rise. Days stretched into a week, and the chest remained sealed in the warehouse, its presence like a silent drumbeat that no one could ignore. By then, the anticipation had grown unbearable. The whispers that had begun as cautious speculation in the streets had turned into an unrelenting chorus. The chest must be opened. Its secret must be known. Scholars had taken their notes. Archivists had presented their theories. The elders had told their memories of the flood. But still, the lock remained unbroken. It stood there like a clenched fist, a refusal to yield even after decades in the water. Yet everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The town seemed to lean toward that moment, as though its collective breath had been drawn in and held, waiting for release. The day chosen for the opening was gray, the sky covered in a quilt of clouds that let in little light. Outside the warehouse, a crowd gathered long before the doors opened. Some came out of curiosity, eager for the spectacle of it all, while others arrived with solemn expressions, as though they were about to witness something sacred. The air buzzed with conversations that rose and fell like waves, the voices of old men recounting once more the stories of the flood, mothers explaining to children why everyone had come, and students from the university speculating about the chest's age and contents. Reporters arrived, their cameras and notepads ready, intent on capturing the unveiling for papers beyond the town. It was no longer a local event, but something larger, the kind of moment that history itself seemed to press upon. Inside, the chest sat upon a raised platform under carefully arranged lights. Around it stood the experts, who had been entrusted with the task of opening it. They moved with the precision of surgeons, their tools laid out neatly, their gloves fitted, their faces drawn with concentration. Before them was not simply an object, but a relic that carried the weight of a century of silence. Every eye in the room was fixed on their hands as they bent toward the lock, corroded but stubbornly intact. The hush that settled over the warehouse was so deep that the faint scrape of metal on metal as they worked seemed deafening. At last, with a sound that echoed like a sigh, the lock gave way. The iron bands, brittle with age, creaked as they were loosened. Slowly, cautiously, the lid was raised, releasing a rush of air heavy with the smell of damp wood and time itself. The moment felt almost intrusive, as though they had pried open not a chest, but a grave. A ripple of awe moved through the crowd as the first glimpses of the interior came into view. It was not gold that shimmered there, nor jewels, nor the glitter of wealth that so many had imagined. Instead, it was the fragile, intimate remains of a life once lived. The first thing seen was a small wooden horse, its wheels worn, its paint faded to pale patches, clinging desperately to the wood. Beside it lay a row of tin soldiers, their uniforms chipped and rusted, yet still lined up in perfect attention, as if the child who had once arranged them had just stepped away for a moment. A plush bear slumped against the side of the chest, its fur darkened and stiff with water, one button eye missing, but its crooked smile intact, hauntingly familiar in its innocence. These toys spoke louder than any jewel ever could, each one a testament to the age and presence of the boy who had once held them. They were not mere objects. They were the remnants of touch, of laughter, of a life stilled too soon. Gasps rose among the onlookers. Some leaned forward, their faces pale, as though confronted by the presence of the child himself. Others clasped their hands, whispering prayers or words of sorrow. It was as if time had peeled back and revealed a room from the past, a nursery sealed in wood and iron, preserved by the river for nearly a century. The experts lifted the objects carefully, one by one, laying them out on white cloths under the bright lights. After the toys came bundles of papers, their edges curled, their ink blurred but still legible in parts. Photographs slipped from between them, sepia-toned images of a small boy in a white suit, standing stiffly in the gardens of the Ashford mansion. In some, he held the hand of a woman in a plain dress, the nursemaid who had cared for him, her expression caught between pride and concern. In others, he stood alone, his smile faint, his eyes shadowed with something weary that no child should bear. The photographs were fragile, nearly crumbling under the touch, yet their power was undeniable. They captured a face that had been erased from history, giving it back to the present. Among the papers were letters, written in neat, slanted handwriting. As they were read aloud in hushed voices, the contents grew clearer. These were correspondences between the nursemaid and a friend in another town. They spoke of the boy's illness, of nights spent by his bedside, of fevers that came and went with cruel persistence. They also carried instructions from the family, written indirectly but heavy with implication. There was to be no talk of the child's condition, no mention of his frailty to anyone beyond the mansion's walls. One letter described the boy as our little secret burden, a phrase that drew audible gasps from the listeners. Another recounted the moment of his death in trembling words, followed by silence, the abrupt end of a life cut short and hidden away. And then came the final discovery, small but profound, a silver locket, tarnished and darkened but still intact. When it was pried open, inside lay a single detail that made the entire room hold its breath. One side contained a tiny photograph of the boy, smiling faintly, his hair combed neatly. The other bore an engraving. Edward Ashford, born 1915. At last, the boy had a name. A century of silence shattered with those words. He was no longer a whisper, no longer a half-remembered rumor passed down by the elderly. He was a child, real and loved, whose memory had been forced into hiding, but now stood undeniable before all. The locket passed carefully from hand to hand, and with each touch, it seemed to grow heavier, as though the weight of Edward's forgotten life had returned. Mothers in the crowd clutched their children closer, while fathers lowered their eyes, ashamed at the thought of how easily a life could be erased. The photographs, the toys, the letters, the locket, all of them spoke with a voice louder than gold ever could. They told the story of a boy who had been denied his place in memory, whose parents had buried their grief under silence, and whose only inheritance had been a chest sent drifting into the river by disaster. The experts finished their work methodically, arranging the objects so they could be preserved and studied. But for the crowd, the work was already done. They had seen enough to understand that the chest was not a treasure trove but a shrine. The flood had tried to bury Edward's memory. The Ashfords had tried to erase it. But the river had preserved it all, carrying it into the future so it could finally be known. In that warehouse, under the trembling light, it felt as though the boy himself had returned. When the crowd dispersed, they did so in silence, their conversations hushed, their faces reflective. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer, and the elders walked slowly, tears slipping down their wrinkled cheeks. The story of Edward Ashford had risen with the chest, and nothing could send it back into the river again. The lock was broken, not just on the chest, but on the silence of time. What had been hidden in shadows now stood revealed, and the town could feel the shift deep in its bones. The night that followed was restless. Windows glowed later than usual as people sat with the weight of what they had seen. The chest had not brought riches to the town, but it had brought something rarer, truth. And though truth was often heavier than gold, it had a way of settling into hearts and reshaping them. Edward Ashford, the boy erased, had returned. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the river that had kept his secret for so long, it seemed somehow brighter, as though it too had been waiting for this moment to set its burden free. The locket's discovery left the town suspended in a silence that lingered long after the warehouse doors closed. It was not the silence of indifference, but of gravity, of the kind that settles after a revelation too profound to be absorbed in a single breath. The name, the toys, the letters, all had torn through the veil of myth and gossip and returned a lost child to the world. People who had come expecting treasure went home shaken, their thoughts consumed by the image of the boy who had once held the tin soldiers, once hugged the bear, once smiled faintly for the camera. His presence, denied for so long, had reclaimed a place in the living memory of the town. It was as though the river itself had conspired against forgetting, holding the chest safe in its dark waters until the right moment arrived to bring it back. News of the opening spread beyond the town almost immediately. Reporters filed their stories, and soon Edward Ashford's name appeared in newspapers that his parents had once paid handsomely to keep it from. Headlines spoke not of riches, but of remembrance, of a child erased by silence and restored by chance. Letters and calls began to arrive at the town offices from historians, genealogists, even distant relatives who had barely known they belonged to the Ashford line. What had once been a family's guarded shame was now a story unfolding in public view, one that resonated far beyond the town's modest streets. The descendants of the Ashford family were among the first to respond. They arrived quietly, unannounced, their polished cars out of place on the narrow lanes. Some carried an air of unease, others of irritation, as though this unearthing of history were a personal inconvenience. They stood before the objects laid out on white cloths and looked at them not with awe, but with discomfort, as though confronted by ghosts they had not invited. For years they had lived with the absence as part of their inheritance, never speaking of Edward, never even acknowledging him in the family's records. Now the locket and the letters and the photographs made denial impossible. Their silence was broken, and the weight of it pressed visibly on their shoulders. The townspeople, for their part, no longer saw the Ashfords as untouchable figures of wealth and power. The chest had stripped away the grandeur, revealing them as a family like any other, subject to loss and weakness, and the desperate urge to hide what pained them. The sight of the toys and the letters had softened hearts, stirring compassion even as it sparked resentment at the years of erasure. The family that had once commanded respect now inspired a more complicated mixture: pity for their grief, anger for their silence, and a quiet determination to ensure that Edward would not vanish again. Meetings were held in the town hall, where historians and local leaders debated what to do with the chest and its contents. The warehouse could no longer hold it, not with so many people demanding to see. Suggestions ranged from keeping the items under lock and key to sending them to a national archive. But the voices that carried strongest were those of the townspeople who argued that Edward's memory belonged not in some distant vault, but in the very place where his story had begun, and where the river had guarded it all these years. The idea of a permanent exhibit in the town's modest museum took hold, and with it, a sense of purpose spread through the community. They would build not just a display, but a memorial, a place where Edward could finally be remembered openly, his existence affirmed and his silence undone. The transformation of the museum began at once. The building itself was small, tucked away on a quiet street, more often visited by school children than tourists. But in the weeks that followed, it became the town's busiest place. Carpenters reinforced its floors to bear the weight of new display cases. Curators worked tirelessly to preserve the fragile papers and photographs, stabilizing them against the decay of time. Conservators cleaned the toys, careful not to erase the marks of wear that spoke of play. The locket was polished just enough to reveal its engraving without stripping away its history. Every step was taken with a reverence that acknowledged not just the objects themselves, but the life they represented. When the exhibit finally opened, the line to enter stretched down the block. Families came dressed in their Sunday best, children holding their parents' hands as though about to attend a ceremony. Inside, the lights were dimmed to a soft glow, guiding visitors toward the central display. There, under glass, lay the wooden horse, the tin soldiers, the plush bear, arranged as though waiting for Edward to return to his nursery. Beside them were the photographs, their sepia tones glowing faintly, and the letters, fragments of words preserved for strangers to read. At the heart of it all, the locket rested alone, open to reveal the tiny face and the engraved name that had once been hidden. The effect was overwhelming. Visitors moved slowly, their footsteps muffled on the polished floors, their voices hushed to whispers. Mothers lingered longest before the toys, their eyes filling with tears as they imagined the small hands that had once cherished them. Fathers studied the letters, their brows furrowed at the cold instructions to keep silent. Children pressed their noses to the glass, curious and saddened, asking questions that their parents struggled to answer. In every corner of the room, emotion hung heavy, not forced or theatrical, but raw, drawn out by the intimacy of the objects. As weeks passed, the museum became more than a place of display. It grew into a space of reflection, of reconciliation between past and present. School teachers brought classes to teach lessons not just in history, but in humanity, reminding children that every life, no matter how brief, mattered. Clergy spoke of forgiveness, of the ways grief twists people into silence, urging compassion even for the choices that had hidden Edward away. And the elders who had once whispered stories by candlelight now walked proudly through the halls, their memories validated, their voices finally heard. The presence of Edward's belongings reshaped the town's sense of itself. No longer was the flood just a story of destruction. It was also a story of preservation, of a river that had carried the memory of a child through decades and delivered it back intact. No longer were the Ashfords untouchable icons. They were people who had suffered, who had chosen wrongly in their fear, and who now could be seen with a measure of empathy. The town itself seemed to breathe differently, its people bound together by the shared responsibility of keeping Edward alive in memory. On the first anniversary of the chest's discovery, a small ceremony was held at the museum. A plaque was unveiled, simple in design, but profound in meaning. It bore Edward's name, his dates of birth and death, and a single inscription: "Remembered at last." The crowd that gathered was quiet, many wiping their eyes as the words were read aloud. In that moment, the boy who had been erased from history stood in the center of it, no longer a ghost, but a presence acknowledged and honored. And so Edward's story came full circle. The chest that had once been cast adrift in tragedy now anchored a community in remembrance. The toys that had once been left behind became symbols of resilience. The letters that once commanded silence now spoke louder than any denial, and the locket that had been hidden away became the heart of an exhibit that drew visitors from near and far. What had begun as a relic of the flood became a testament to the endurance of memory and the impossibility of erasure. The river continued to flow, its waters dark and unhurried, carrying with it secrets yet unknown. But the town no longer looked at it the same way. Where once they had seen only a threat, they now saw a keeper, a witness to history. Each ripple reminded them that the past, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of returning when it is needed most. And each glance at the museum reminded them of the boy who had been denied his voice, but who, through chance and persistence of memory, spoke again. Thus the story of Edward Ashford, silenced by fear and hidden by tragedy, was restored. His life, though short, was no longer absent from the records of his family or his town. He was present in the whispers of visitors, in the tears of mothers, in the questions of children, and in the plaque that bore his name. Memory had been restored, and with it a measure of peace. The chest had risen from the depths, and with it had risen the truth, unshakable at last. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.